On a winter night in her small-town living room, Elaine Harper listened to the storm and worried that her new kitten's head always felt too cold in her hands. He ate and played like a healthy house cat, yet that chill on her palm kept echoing a hospital room and a forehead she could not keep warm. When the wind rattled the windows hardest, the kitten climbed into her lap and pressed one tiny paw under her chin, quietly asking what she feared. The house always seemed loudest after the sun went down. Wood sighed in the walls. The fridge hummed and clicked, and the baseboard heater made its thin metallic ticks like someone tapping a spoon on a cup. Elaine Harper sat in her armchair by the front window and told herself it was only an old place breathing. Lately, though, a new sound had joined the familiar chorus. It was quick and light, a faint skitter along the hallway rug that stopped just short of the living room. It tended to come at the same time each evening, regular enough that her ears waited for it even when her eyes stayed on the television. One winter morning, in the thin grey light, she noticed a small depression in the sofa cushion opposite her chair. No one had sat there. The fabric was ruffled in two tight circles, as if something had turned around before settling. When she pressed her palm into the spot, the air there felt oddly cooler than the rest of the room. Near the back door, she found delicate crescent marks in the thin layer of dust on the floorboards. They were no wider than her fingernail, arranged in tiny pairs that led to the empty metal dish she hadn't moved in months. She knelt slowly, knees complaining, and traced one curve with the tip of her finger. At night, the remote on her chair arm seemed to shift a little on its own. She would hear a faint scrape of plastic, look down, and find it edged a breath closer to the cushion's centre. The heater would sigh right then, and she'd scold herself for jumping at nothing more than vibration and age. Once, dozing in her chair, she woke with the strange certainty that something warm had just been resting against her chest. The skin at the base of her throat tingled, as if a tiny weight had touched and then lifted away. When she sat up, the room was empty, her own pulse louder than the ticking clock. Another evening she discovered a short striped hair clinging to the cuff of her cardigan. It caught the lamplight, pale against the knit. Elaine rolled it between her fingers, feeling a small shiver creep along her wrist as she tried to remember brushing against any coat that could have left it there. The skittering in the hallway grew more familiar than the television shows she let run for company. Sometimes it came with the sound of something soft bumping lightly against the baseboard, then stopping as soon as she leaned forward in her chair, listening. Each time, she settled back with a nervous little laugh. On one especially quiet night, the floorboard near the doorway creaked even though she hadn't moved. A shadow passed briefly across the edge of the lamp's light, low and close to the ground, then vanished again. The air along the floor seemed to carry a faint warmth, like breath dissipating. When she walked to the kitchen, she could feel a brush of cooler air around her ankles, as though something small had rushed past and just missed her. She told herself it was the old back door letting in drafts. Yet she found herself stepping more carefully in the dim hall. The empty metal dish by the door began to feel less like a forgotten object and more like an invitation that had been quietly answered. Some mornings it sat a few inches to the left or right, as if nudged by an unseen visitor who didn't quite know where it belonged. She straightened it without thinking, and then wondered why. Sitting alone in her armchair with the television volume low, Elaine tried to convince herself it was all in her head. House noises, settling, dust, tricks of light. Still, something inside her whispered that a pattern was forming. Small things were moving through her rooms at the same times, in the same ways, as if testing the edges of her life. By the end of that first week, yet she found herself stepping more carefully in the dim hall. The empty metal dish by the door began to feel less like a forgotten object and more like an invitation that had been quietly answered. Some mornings it sat a few inches to the left or right, as if nudged by an unseen visitor who didn't quite know where it belonged. She straightened it without thinking, and then wondered why. Sitting alone in her armchair with the television volume low, Elaine tried to convince herself it was all in her head. House noises, settling dust, tricks of light. Still, something inside her whispered that a pattern was forming. Small things were moving through her rooms at the same times, in the same ways, as if testing the edges of her life. By the end of that first week, the empty bowl shivered once and rocked in place before settling. The air along the floor brushed cool around her ankles, and the hairs on the back of her neck lifted. A small shape eased out from behind the armchair. Large ears, narrow face, fur patterned in soft grey-brown stripes, tail held low but steady. The kitten moved with the careful determination of something that had learned to expect disappointment but come anyway. It crept toward the bowl, belly close to the rug. Elaine froze, fingers tightening on the damp towel. The little paws made no sound on the fabric. Only the faint clink of metal spoke again when the tiny nose bumped the inside of the bowl. The kitten peered in, whiskers trembling, as if hoping the emptiness might change its mind. The sight of that hopeful inspection made her chest ache. Without thinking, she shifted her weight and took half a step forward. The floorboard under her heel creaked. The kitten flinched, ears flattening for a heartbeat, but it did not run. It turned instead, serious eyes measuring the distance between them. From this angle, she could see how fine the fur lay across its forehead, almost too flat against the delicate skull. When the kitten inched closer, curiosity edging past fear, she let one hand drift out, palm open and low. The air above its head felt noticeably cooler than the warmth radiating from its narrow back. "You poor little thing," she whispered, voice barely more than breath. The words tasted of hospital hallways and last visits. A familiar knot formed under her breastbone, and she snatched her hand back, startled by the sharpness of the memory as much as by the kitten's nearness. The kitten watched her retreat for a long second. Its whiskers moved, catching the light. Then it did something that made the room feel smaller. It rose, somewhat clumsily, onto its hind legs. Front paws lifted as if searching for balance against the invisible line of air between them. One tiny paw reached higher, wobbling. The pads brushed the empty space just below her chin, not quite touching, as though testing whether it was allowed to close that last short distance. Elaine held perfectly still, heart beating a little too loudly in her ears. A drop of rain smacked harder against the window, making her glance sideways. When she looked back, the kitten had dropped to all fours again, standing squarely on the rug. Its tail flicked once, not in threat, but in some small private decision she could not yet read. The metal bowl at its feet seemed to anchor the moment. She realized, absurdly, that she felt embarrassed, caught unprepared to be looked at with such direct, simple expectation. It was one thing to sense a presence moving through her home. It was another to have it stand there and ask something of her with its eyes. Later, when the room had grown darker and the television washed the walls with blue, she would think of that unsteady little paw hovering under her chin. It felt, even in memory, less like a request for food and more like a question pressed gently into a place she hadn't wanted to examine for a long time. Why here? Why now? Why her? Chapter 3. Roads before her door. In the days that followed, Elaine found her thoughts drifting to where the kitten might have come from. At the small-town grocery store, while canned soup slid along the belt, she caught herself staring past the shelves, picturing the outskirts where old barns leaned into the wind and fields slept under frost. The cashier, a young man who liked to talk about weather and farms, mentioned that the Miller place had seen litters again that fall. They wander in when it turns nasty, he said, sliding her bread into a paper bag. Follow the trucks and the smell of food, especially the little ones that fall behind. She nodded, feeling something tighten. Driving home, she imagined a narrow striped body moving along the ditch edge, keeping just far enough from the road to avoid headlights. Maybe it had slipped between the backs of restaurants on Main Street, drawn by the clatter of kitchen doors and the hiss of hot grease. Wind would cut through fur quicker than it did through wool. Before town, there might have been haylofts and feed sacks, bales stacked like walls, and patches of light spilling between boards. She saw in her mind a mother stretched too thin across too many mouths, while the smallest one wriggled to keep its place along the warmest flank, sometimes nudged away by stronger shoulders. Those images pressed too neatly against her own past. After her husband died, she had felt like that smallest body on the coldest board, watching the rest of the world cluster closer to warmth somewhere else. Neighbours brought casseroles and hugged her in doorways. And then the meals stopped coming and the hugs turned into nods from the sidewalk. Back in her kitchen, she rinsed a shallow saucer and set it down near the spot where the kitten had first appeared. Her movements were deliberate. As if she were performing a small ceremony she didn't quite admit to herself. She filled it with a little food, then straightened and pretended to busy herself with the mail. That night, the faint clink of tongue against metal drifted from the living room. Elaine sat in her armchair, book open but forgotten on her lap, eyes fixed on the lamp's circle of light. She didn't turn toward the sound. Somehow, looking would feel like snapping a fragile thread the kitten had chosen to trust. The dish was empty by morning. 2 sets of tiny dusty prints crossed and recrossed between the doorway and the saucer, like a child's scribbles practicing a new letter. She found herself smiling at them in spite of the cold air seeping under the back door. She had proof now that someone else paced these floors. Later that day, walking the hallway outside her bedroom, she realized how similar her own path looked. The carpet showed a faint, worn trail where she had walked for weeks after the funeral, unable to cross the threshold without feeling her lungs grow tight. Grief had its own way of wearing patterns into a house. She thought of how many times the kitten must have been turned away by closed doors or sudden movements, learning that retreat meant safety. She had learned something similar with her heart, that staying ready for loss meant never fully letting weight down on hope. Both lessons made sense. Both came at a cost. One evening, as she knelt to wipe up a little spill near the saucer, the kitten hovered just beyond her reach. Its eyes followed the motion of the cloth, body poised between approach and escape, were both skittish. "Aren't we?" she murmured, not sure which of them she meant more, running her fingers lightly along the new small tracks in the dust. Elaine understood that trust would not be easy for either of them. The kitten would have to risk drawing closer to a pair of human hands. She would have to risk reaching out without immediately jerking back. Somewhere between the bowl and the armchair, some new road might be forming. Chapter 4: The First True Touch. The kitten folded itself into her days faster than she would have predicted. By the end of the week, it appeared almost as reliably as the evening news theme. It lingered near the doorway when the kettle hissed in the morning, traced slow circles on the rug while she ate lunch, and claimed a corner of her blanket when darkness fell. It still kept a careful distance from her hands. If she moved too quickly, it vanished into the hallway shadows, leaving only a faint warmth where its small body had been. Elaine learned to open drawers gently, to set her mug down without clatter, to shift her legs with the patience of someone playing a long game. The worry about its cool little head rode quietly beneath all this. Sometimes, when the kitten curled on the arm of her chair, she let her fingers hover above its forehead, feeling the difference between the solid heat of its back and the almost chilly fur at its brow. Each time, the familiar knot of dread tugged at her ribs. One drizzly afternoon, rain ticking a restless rhythm on the windows, she picked up the phone. The living room was washed in grey light from the overcast sky, the television murmuring to itself in the corner. The kitten paced the rug, glancing up every so often as if it knew the call had something to do with it. The clinic's hold music crackled faintly in her ear as she watched it move. It hopped onto the ottoman, slid a little on the fabric, then scrambled back to balance with a surprised squeak. Despite her worry, Elaine's mouth curved into a small, involuntary smile. "Hes active?" the nurse eventually asked, and she answered, "Very." She described the cool forehead, the good appetite, the way he chased dust motes in the morning light. The nurse's voice stayed calm and practical. "Watch the breathing, the energy, the bathroom habits. If he's eating, playing, and not hiding, that's reassuring," the woman said. "But bring him in Monday so we can be sure." After she hung up, reassurance only half settled over her. The weather report on television warned of a winter front moving in. Coloured maps showing bands of ice wrapping around the town. The house felt dimmer than the hour should have allowed. The heater rattled against the burden of keeping up. The kitten climbed up onto the arm of her chair, pausing like a small sentry. Elaine's fingers twitched toward him and then stopped. She could feel the old fear rising again. That sense that disaster always waited just past her control. How many times had she stood in hospital rooms, willing numbers on machines to change? For a moment, she let her hands fall to her lap, palms open. The kitten watched that choice with bright green eyes, tail tip flicking. Then he stepped down onto her legs, paws light on the soft knit. He kneaded the blanket twice, testing, before moving higher until his narrow chest leaned against her sternum. Slowly, almost clumsily, he rose on his hind legs. One tiny paw reached up and pressed, this time with clear intent, against the underside of her chin. The cool pads met her skin directly, a steady, grounding pressure. Elaine's breath hitched. The gesture felt startlingly familiar, echoing a touch she hadn't let herself remember clearly in a long while. Her husband had cupped her chin like that in the hospital when words had begun to fail him. Head used that simple pressure to anchor her eyes to his, to pull her away from the beeping numbers and the machine's hollow glow. Now, impossibly, this small creature was recreating that same map on her skin. Tears pricked, unexpected and sharp. Elaine lifted one hand and, very carefully, laid it along the kitten's back, not to check his temperature, but simply to feel him there. His body vibrated with a tentative purr. For the first time since he appeared, she allowed herself to wonder if he had been sent for more than company. The appointment at the clinic was set for Monday. The storm arrived on Sunday, shrugging its way over the hills with no regard for plans. By late afternoon, grey had thickened into something heavier, and the maple tree outside her front window bent under gusts that made its bare branches scrape a relentless line along the siding. Inside, Elaine moved through her usual storm preparations. She closed curtains, checked the flashlight drawer, and made sure the battery clock still ticked on the wall. Sleet began to rattle against the glass, first lightly, then with the sound of thrown sand. The heater groaned as it wrestled with the cold pressing at every crack. The kitten shadowed her steps more closely than ever. When she tucked a folded towel along the back door to stop the draft, he pressed his small body against her ankle, fur brushing her sock as if he meant to plug the gap himself. Every sharp rattle against the window made his ears twitch, but he did not run to hide. Her worry, already stirred up by the call to the clinic, stretched thin as old cloth. She found her hand drifting again and again to his head, tracing from warm spine to cooler brow. Each pass brought back the uninvited memory of her husband's forehead under fluorescent lights, skin cooling even as machines still hummed beside the bed. The lights flickered once, twice. The television snapped off mid-sentence, leaving the room oddly hollow. The refrigerator fell silent. Elaine held her breath. Fingers curled around the arm of her chair until the lamps steadied again. The threat of darkness and the loss of heat that would follow settled into the base of her throat. She stepped to the front window, peering past her reflection into the smudged world outside. The street lamp cast a thin circle of light on pavement already gleaming with a slick sheen. She imagined the road to the clinic, the low stretch that always flooded, now hiding ice beneath shallow water. In her mind, tires slid and boots slipped. The thought of staying home felt almost as reckless. What if the coolness on his head meant something they were missing? What if they were losing time while she sat and second-guessed herself? She pictured herself years from now, adding this night to the catalogue of what-ifs that already lived behind her ribs. Her fingers tightened around the phone. Numbers for the clinic, for neighbours, for emergency lines sat in its quiet glass. The television, when she turned it back on, showed pictures of cars angled into ditches and warning banners along the bottom of the screen. Stay home if you can, the anchor repeated. The kitten cut through her spiraling thoughts with a sharp, almost scolding meow. He scrambled up the side of the armchair with a clumsy scramble of claws and landed against her chest. Elaine caught him automatically, hands forming that now familiar cradle. His body felt hot with life, heart pounding fast under her fingers. For a long moment she stood there, storm pressing fists of wind against the glass, Kitten pressed against her sweater. She understood, dimly, that every time she checked his temperature, she was not just measuring his health. She was weighing it against that one terrible night when all warmth seemed to drain out of the world at once. The lamps dimmed again and then held. The heater coughed and continued its steady push of warm air. Elaine exhaled slowly, the sound shaky in the quiet room. Something inside her recognized that she could not keep living in a house where every small concern became a doorway back into that hospital. Tonight, something had to change. She eased back into her chair, drawing the kitten with her, and pulled a heavier blanket over them both. The old house groaned as wind hit it square on the side. But inside, the small cocoon of lamplight and shared warmth held. She let her hand rest between his shoulders and, for once, did not let it wander to his forehead. Outside, the storm went on making its wild case. Trees bent. Sirens rose and fell in the distance, and ice ticked against the glass. Inside, another argument quieted. Elaine did not know exactly what decision she had made yet, only that she would no longer let fear alone do the talking. The kitten's steady breathing told her she was not making it entirely on her own. In the end, she chose not to drive. The weather updates grew more insistent, red banners marching across the screen with each half hour. Roads are treacherous, the meteorologist said, voice firm. Elaine set the phone down on the side table as though it had become heavy, then lifted the kitten into her arms again. She settled into her armchair with a thicker blanket than usual, tucking it around both of them. The lamp cast a warm pool of light that seemed to push back against the grey stormlight leaking in around the edges of the curtains. Outside, wind whistled in the chimney, turning the house into a low, uneasy instrument. The kitten did not find stillness easily at first. He paced across her lap, kneaded the blanket with determined little paws, and then scrambled up onto the back of the chair. His tail flicked in short, agitated strokes, each time her hand rose toward him. He tolerated the touch, eyes half closed, purr rumbling faintly through his ribs. Her mind slipped backward whether she invited it or not. Hospital corridors unfurled beneath her feet, smelling of antiseptic and burned coffee. Monitors glowed softened green and blue in dark rooms. She remembered sitting beside her husband, pressing her hand again and again to his forehead, as if sheer will and contact could bring warmth back. A tear escaped without her noticing its start. It slid along the line beside her nose and reached the corner of her mouth. Elaine drew in a breath that shuddered in the middle. That sound, that tiny break, seemed to change the air in the room. The kitten abandoned his perch and moved back toward her lap with new purpose. He climbed higher than usual, paws working their way up the folds of blanket until his front feet rested on her collarbone. His whiskers brushed her chin. His breath puffed warm against her throat. Outside, a distant ambulance siren rose and fell, stitching the present storm to that old night in a way that made her chest clench. Then he acted with a clarity that stopped all the spinning in her head. He pushed up onto his hind legs, using her as his anchor, and pressed his paw firmly into the soft place under her chin. Not a tap, not an accidental bump, a steady, insistent touch, holding her gaze away from the window and the storm and the ghostly machines of memory. Elaine froze, lungs pausing mid-breath. The sensation layered itself over the remembered weight of her husband's hand, the way he had cupped her chin when his voice grew thin. He had used that touch to call her back from staring at screens, to remind her that his eyes, not the numbers, were the important thing. Somehow, impossibly, this little creature was redrawing that map. The realization came slowly, like a tide easing over sand. She saw that she had not been checking the kitten's forehead simply to make sure he was all right. She had been trying to rewrite a moment she could not change, to prove that this time her vigilance and love would be enough to hold something warm in place. Her shoulders sagged as the truth settled. The kitten kept his paw where it was until her breathing softened. When he finally lowered it, he didn't move far. He tucked himself into the hollow of her chest, head resting just under her chin. His small body curved to match the shape of her. She let one hand rest along his back without searching for anything but the rhythm of his breathing. Outside, the storm began to move on, its roar growing a little more distant with each gust. Inside, the loudest thing became the quiet sound of his purr threaded through her heartbeat. For the first time since she had brought him in from the edges of her life, she allowed herself to believe that he might be doing the same for her. By morning, the worst of the storm had passed. The sky was pale and brittle. Streets shimmered with a crust of ice, and salt glittered in uneven lines along the sidewalks. Elaine carried the kitten in a carrier down the short front path, boots crunching, his indignant chirps bouncing around inside the plastic shell. She drove slowly, both hands on the wheel, tires gripping carefully along sanded roads. At each red light, she glanced at the carrier resting on the passenger seat. When she slipped a fingertip through the bars, his nose bumped her knuckle and warm breath puffed against her skin. pulling a small smile from her mouth, despite herself. The vet clinic smelled of disinfectant and dog shampoo, with soft country music playing near the reception desk. In the exam room, Dr. Miller listened to Elaine's story about the cool forehead, nodding as she lifted the kitten onto the metal table. The stethoscope's bell moved along his ribs. His sides rose and fell in a steady rhythm. Strong heart, good lungs, the vet said, smiling. She pressed her fingers gently along his small skull. Skin's thinner up here, more exposed to drafts. Feels cooler to us, but everything inside is working as it should. Hair's bright-eyed, active, eating well. This is a healthy little fellow. Relief washed through Elaine, so suddenly she gripped the edge of the table for balance. On the drive home, she found herself humming along with the radio without realizing it. The carrier rattled softly when he complained about every stop sign, his voice now a reassuring annoyance instead of a cause for alarm. Life did not suddenly transform, but it did unfold differently. Morning coffee came with a new ritual. The little tabby batting gently at the corner of her newspaper until she lifted it enough for him to crawl beneath like a small, warm secret. His tail would flick from under the pages, marking his position. Midday. He took up a post on the windowsill, watching mail trucks and dog walkers move through the neighborhood. Elaine found herself joining him there, standing with one hand on the frame, following his gaze as if seeing the familiar street for the first time. Sometimes she waved to Mrs. Park, whose surprised smile grew more frequent. Neighbours began to notice not just the small striped face at the window, but the way curtains were open earlier and lamplight burned later. Mailman Joe remarked, with an easy grin, that he heard laughter from inside again when he slid letters through the slot. "Sounds good on this street," he said, tipping his cap. Elaine returned, cautiously at first, to her volunteer shift at the library. She shelved books, recommended novels, and found that her voice no longer snagged on certain phrases. When someone asked, "Do you live alone?" she answered, after a small pause, "Mostly. I've got a little one at home now who keeps an eye on me." Some evenings, she experimented with leaving the television off. In the quiet, she could hear the tick of the clock, the faint rush of cars on the distant highway, and the soft thump as the kitten jumped from windowsill to chair. The silence didn't feel so sharp with his small sounds threading through it. Every night, their new ritual unfolded like a gentle refrain. Elaine settled into her armchair as the day wound down. The kitten climbed into her lap, then higher, until his front paws rested against her chest. He would stretch just enough to rest one paw under her chin, sometimes only for a heartbeat, sometimes much longer when the day had been heavy. In that small, repeated gesture, the house slowly changed shape. It no longer felt like a museum dedicated to what she had lost. It felt instead like a home where something was being tended, where grief and comfort could sit together in the same room without fighting for all the air. By late summer, the yard had softened into greens and golds. The maple tree out front cast generous shade over the porch, its leaves turning the evening light into a quiet green glow. Elaine moved a narrow bench there and painted it a soft blue that made her think of clear skies instead of hospital ceilings. Most evenings found her seated on that bench with a glass of iced tea, condensation dampening her fingers. The tabby, now lean and graceful, stretched along the back like a striped scarf, tail curled neatly around the far end. He kept at least one paw resting somewhere on her shoulder or collarbone, as if claiming his post. The neighbourhood provided its own gentle soundtrack. A bicycle clicked past. A dog 2 houses down announced each passer-by. Somewhere, a radio played an old song from her youth. Closer, there was the familiar creak of porch boards when she shifted and the occasional jingle of his collar when he adjusted to keep his touch on her. Inside, the house had rearranged itself around their shared life. A basket of toys leaned against the armchair. The once forgotten water dish by the back door now caught morning light in a thin ring twice a day. On a shelf near her husband's photograph sat a small ceramic dish holding a collar tag and a smooth stone from the yard. At her own annual checkup, Elaine's doctor commented on the improvement in her numbers. Blood pressure steadier, sleep patterns better. Whatever you've added to your routine, keep it, he said with a smile. She thought of stormy nights and soft paws and said simply, just a bit more company at home. Sometimes, when summer thunderheads built up beyond the hills, their dark shapes glowing at the edges, she still felt a flicker of the old alarm. On those evenings, the air in the living room seemed to tense with her. Before the anxiety could harden, the tabby would leave his windowsill and make his way to her chair. He climbed into her lap, then up along her chest, pressing his paw under her chin with the same firm assurance he had used in winter. The difference was in her reaction. Instead of freezing, she met his gaze, let out a long breath, and felt the echo of medical machines recede, replaced by a steady purr vibrating against her ribs. Friends who visited commented on him first. Of course, the dignified little cat who clearly believed the armchair was his. But they always ended up talking about her. You look lighter, Mrs. Park said one afternoon over coffee, stirring sugar into her cup. Like the house finally fits you again. Elaine glanced at the tabby in the doorway and understood exactly what she meant. On one particularly gentle evening, as the sun slid low and turned the street to honey, Elaine lifted her cat to eye level on the porch. His green eyes blinked slowly. That soft, content signal she had learned to read. She rested her forehead briefly against his, feeling the warm, living weight of him. "Your head feels just right," she murmured, voice roughened by emotion and time. He answered in the way he always had, stretching forward with practiced ease. He placed his paw under her chin, pressing lightly as if sealing an old agreement. Her quiet, surprised laugh mingled with the first notes of the crickets starting up in the grass. In that small, familiar touch, she felt the shape of her days ahead. They would not be perfect days, or empty of storms, or free of the occasional ache when memories brushed too close. But they would be shared between a woman who had learned to let her heart risk warmth again and a once cold-headed kitten who had found exactly where to place his paw. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.